In the quiet, windswept hills of rural Montana, the tight-knit Native American community of the Blackfeet Reservation was forever changed in the summer of 1945. Two sisters, Mariah and Elisa, were seen walking home from a small market just as the sun began its descent behind the mountains. The path they took was familiar, a winding dirt road leading back to their modest home. They had often walked this way together, their laughter filling the air as they passed the same landmarks. But on that evening, something was different. Their footsteps, once steady and confident, faded into the dusk, leaving only silence in their wake. By nightfall, the family realized something was wrong. Mariah, the older of the two, had always been protective of Elisa. The thought of the young girls lost in the dark, alone, was enough to bring immediate panic to their home. As word of the sisters' disappearance spread, the community rallied. Local families gathered in search parties, their flashlights flickering like fireflies through the dense trees. But despite their efforts, no trace of Mariah or Elisa was found. The area around the market, the woods, and the fields, all were scoured with no sign of the girls. The investigation quickly turned to law enforcement, but with no clear evidence and little to go on, the authorities, distant and unfamiliar with the reservation's close-knit dynamics, seemed unsure of how to proceed. A lack of resources and cultural differences caused tension to bubble just beneath the surface. Some in the community, feeling ignored by outside authorities, began to wonder if anyone would truly care to find the girls. The officers, meanwhile, struggled to understand the nuances of the reservation's insular life. Days passed, then weeks, and still no answers emerged. It was as though the earth itself had swallowed Mariah and Elisa whole. For the investigators, it was as if they had disappeared into thin air. Rumors began to spread, whispers of supernatural forces, ancient curses, and even stories of shadowy figures seen near the reservation's outskirts. For some, it was easier to believe in something otherworldly than to confront the possibility of something darker, a crime left unspoken, a secret buried deep in the heart of a fractured community. But for the family, the pain of not knowing was unbearable. Their hope, now a flickering flame, dimmed with each passing day. Mariah and Elisa's mother, Sarah, refused to believe they were gone. She would wait by the window, staring out into the distance, hoping against hope that they would come home. As months turned into years and the search slowly fizzled out, Sarah clung to the idea that one day, somehow, her daughters would walk back through the door. But as the years dragged on, that hope became a heavy burden, one that weighed down on her heart and drained the color from her face. Law enforcement, overwhelmed by the passage of time, eventually stopped looking. No more search. Parties were organized. No more questions were asked. Mariah and Elisa's disappearance became a cold case, a tragedy that would haunt the community, but one that seemed destined to remain unsolved. The reservation, a place of quiet resilience, was now left with the echoes of their absence. The sisters' names were spoken with a bittersweet reverence, memories frozen in time as if they had never truly left, but in truth, they were fading into the forgotten corners of the past. For Nathaniel, their older brother, the pain never ceased. He could not, would not, let go of the search. Even when his own children were born and his life carried on, the memory of Mariah and Elisa hung over him like a shadow. They were not gone, he believed. He refused to accept it. But as he grew older, Nathaniel knew that without new leads, without evidence to point him in the right direction, the answers might never come. Every year, on the anniversary of their disappearance, he would return to the place where they were last seen. Standing there, in the same quiet fields, he would search the landscape, as if hoping to find a trace, a sign, something that would bring him closure. But each time, the world around him remained unchanged, and the silence only grew louder. In 1945, the footsteps of two young sisters vanished into the dusk. In the years that followed, the trail went cold. What happened to Mariah and Elisa remains a haunting mystery, their fates unknown. All that remains are the unanswered questions, and the hearts of those who loved them, forever broken. For Nathaniel, The search for Mariah and Elisa became more than just an obligation. It was a quiet promise to his mother, a vow he made long ago in the empty spaces of their home. The sisters' disappearance had shattered the small, close-knit family, leaving a void that nothing could fill. But for Nathaniel, it was a wound that would never heal. Day after day, year after year, he retraced their steps, driven by the desperate hope that somewhere, hidden in the wilds of Montana, were the answers he so desperately needed. As the years passed, the case slipped further from the public's consciousness. Local law enforcement, stretched thin by the demands of rural life, had little to offer. Search parties dwindled in number, and the media, once interested, moved on to the next story. The Blackfeet Reservation, isolated and often overlooked by outsiders, was left to grieve on its own. But Nathaniel could not, would not, let go. He had seen the pain in his mother's eyes before she passed, the silent tears she cried at night when she thought no one was watching. He couldn't let her be the only one to remember them. And so, he continued searching. He spent his days combing through the dense forests, trudging through the thick brush, hoping for even the slightest trace of his sisters. Sometimes, he thought he saw something, a broken branch, a faint footprint in the mud. His heart would race at the sight, a flicker of hope sparking within him. But every time he approached, the clues would vanish as quickly as they had appeared, leaving him with nothing but more questions and a deepening sense of dread. The seasons changed, and with them, so did Nathaniel. His obsession consumed him, slowly eroding the vibrant young man he had once been. He became a figure in the community, a ghost of the person he had been, haunted by the faces of his sisters that he could never forget. Friends stopped inviting him to social gatherings, their unease palpable. They watched from a distance as Nathaniel withdrew deeper into himself, his mind spiraling further into the search that had overtaken his life. The once friendly young man who had laughed and joked with neighbors was now a shadow, a man driven by the memory of what was lost. There were nights when Nathaniel lay awake, staring up at the ceiling, haunted by the silence that surrounded him. He wondered if anyone could truly understand the weight of his quest. How could they? To them, the search was just another tragedy in a town filled with its share of sorrow. But to Nathaniel, it was everything. Each day without answers was another day he felt he was losing his sisters all over again. As the years turned into decades, his search became more methodical, more frantic. He kept meticulous records, notes, sketches, and photographs of the places he had searched. He marked every possible clue, no matter how small. The broken branches, the faint footprints, the unusual sounds in the woods. He thought, perhaps foolishly, that if he could just piece it all together, he could find them. He could bring them home. But the longer Nathaniel searched, the more he began to question his own mind. The signs he once believed were evidence began to feel like illusions, figments of his fractured hope. Had he really found those footprints, or had his mind simply conjured them from the depths of his grief? The lines between reality and obsession began to blur, and Nathaniel could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. Despite everything, he refused to stop. He couldn't. It was as if giving up would mean letting his sisters slip entirely from memory, slipping further away than they already had. And so, he continued, walking those same woods, retracing those same steps year after year, never wavering in his pursuit. But as the years passed, the toll on him became impossible to ignore. His body, once strong and sure, grew frail and worn. His mind, once sharp and focused, now raced with doubt and confusion. By the time Nathaniel was in his late 50s, the search had cost him nearly everything. His family had distanced themselves, worried about his mental state. The local community had grown weary of his relentless pursuit. Yet, he pressed on, now more alone than ever before. It was as if he had become a prisoner of the past, locked in a battle with memories that refused to let him go. The only comfort he found now was in the briefest moments, the occasional clue, however insignificant, that reignited his hope. But those moments were fewer and fewer. Nathaniel had spent his life chasing ghosts. And now, with time slipping away, he wondered if the real ghost was him, a man trapped in a cycle of endless searching, forever haunted by the faces of two sisters he could never bring home. As the years passed, the pain of Mariah and Elisa's disappearance lingered, casting a long shadow over their family. For Nathaniel, each passing day without answers deepened the wound. But for his mother, Sarah, the years slowly wore away her resolve. In the beginning, she had been strong. She never stopped hoping, believing that one day her daughters would return. But by 1965, 20 years after their disappearance, the weight of the loss had become too much. Sarah's grief was quiet, but constant, like a storm she carried within herself, one that left her more and more distant from her family. Her face, once warm and full of life, had softened with sadness, her eyes constantly searching for a sign that the girls were still out there. Over time, the hope she clung to began to fade. It was as though the life had been drained from her, leaving behind only the hollow space where her daughters had once been. She would sit by the window, her gaze fixed on the long road leading into the distance, but no matter how many times she looked, Mariah and Elisa never returned. Sarah's passing in 1965 marked the end of an era for Nathaniel. She had been the last person to believe that the girls could still be found, the last person to hold out hope. And with her death, Nathaniel was left standing alone in his grief. His obsession with finding the truth now had no anchor, no comforting presence to keep him grounded. The search, once a family effort, became his alone. His mother's death only intensified his determination, but it also deepened the isolation that had been creeping in for years. Nathaniel's resolve to find his sisters never wavered, but the toll it took on him was undeniable. His family, though still grieving their loss, began to move on with their lives. They watched as Nathaniel grew more and more distant, consumed by his search. He became a man haunted by memories of the past, a man defined by his obsession. The same people who had once supported him in his efforts now looked at him with a mixture of pity and discomfort. They didn't understand the depth of his pain, nor could they relate to the desperation he felt. To them, the search was just another tragedy, a story that had been told too many times with no resolution. They had stopped asking questions, stopped looking for answers. But Nathaniel couldn't let go. The community, once tightly knit, began to drift apart. Nathaniel too drifted, further away from his family, further away from everyone who could have helped him. The life he had once known was slipping through his fingers, replaced by the cold grip of obsession. He spent his days walking the same trails, revisiting the same spots, hoping for even the faintest sign of Mariah or Elisa. But the years had turned everything to dust. The places they had last walked were now barren, empty. The clues, once so hopeful, had dried up long ago. All that remained were dead ends and Nathaniel's own lingering doubts. As the years wore on, Nathaniel's obsession became more pronounced. He marked his progress with photographs and notes, carefully documenting every step of his journey. But each day felt more like the last. His mental state began to deteriorate. The search, once a means of healing, now felt like a never-ending loop. He questioned his own mind, wondering if he was seeing things that weren't there. A broken branch here, a footprint there. Could they really be signs, or had his mind simply created them? It was impossible to tell. The weight of his grief was suffocating, and the clarity he once had seemed like a distant memory. Nathaniel had never been one to back down, but the years of searching had turned him into someone unrecognizable. His family had grown distant, their patience worn thin. They no longer understood the man he had become. He had stopped being the brother, the son, the man they once knew. Instead, he was a man consumed by a past that refused to let him go. He was living in a world of ghosts, chasing memories that were slipping further and further out of reach. In his late 40s, Nathaniel stood alone, a man defined by loss. His obsession had cost him nearly everything: his family, his friends, his own sense of self. The search that had once defined him had now become a prison, one from which he could not escape. Yet, he couldn't stop. The need for closure, the need to know what had happened to Mariah and Elisa, was a weight he couldn't shed. But with each passing day, Nathaniel's hope grew fainter. The truth, if it existed, was slipping further away. The world around him had moved on, but he remained stuck in a place where time seemed to stand still. The search, once a way to heal, had turned into a way to hold on to the past. Nathaniel was now a man who lived in the shadows of what could have been, a man searching for answers that he may never find. The disappearance of his sisters had become a part of him, and in the end, that was all that was left, a man who couldn't let go, who couldn't accept that the truth might never come. In 1985, 30 years after the disappearance of Mariah and Elisa, Nathaniel found himself once again clinging to hope. But it was a fragile hope, barely a whisper against the overwhelming silence that had defined the years. His search had become a solitary obsession, the faces of his sisters etched into his memory, but growing fainter with time. The world around him had moved on, but Nathaniel was stuck, chasing shadows of the past, unable to let go of a wound that never healed. His family had long since turned away, weary of his relentless pursuit. They had learned to live without the girls, but Nathaniel could not. He couldn't escape the thought that somewhere, out there, were the answers that could put the past to rest. Then, a break, a glimmer of something real. A local hunter, a man who had grown up in the area, reported something odd. He claimed he had seen a faintly familiar object in a barn just a few miles from where Mariah and Elisa had vanished all those years ago. The hunter described it as a strange bundle wrapped in cloth, something that seemed out of place. At first, Nathaniel dismissed it as just another false lead, another of the countless rumors he had followed over the years. But something in the man's voice, the way he spoke of it, made Nathaniel listen. It wasn't much, but it was something. For the first time in years, Nathaniel felt the stirrings of hope. Could this be the sign he had been waiting for? With renewed urgency, Nathaniel drove to the barn. It was a familiar route, one he had taken countless times before in his search for answers. The area was still as remote as it had been in the days when the girls disappeared, but now there was a sense of foreboding in the air. The barn, worn by years of neglect, stood alone against the horizon, its weathered wood giving off an eerie silence. Nathaniel approached cautiously, every step heavy with the weight of expectation. Could this be the moment when the truth would finally be revealed? Could the search that had consumed his life now be at an end? But when Nathaniel entered the barn, his heart sank. There was nothing. The barn was empty. The bundle the hunter had described was nowhere to be found. His fingers traced the dusty floorboards as he walked through the space, his breath catching in his throat. There was no sign that anyone had been there recently. The silence in the barn was thick, as if the years had swallowed everything whole. It was just another dead end, another bitter disappointment. The hope that had been kindled inside him began to flicker and die, replaced by the same cold realization that had greeted him so many times before. This was not the answer. The hunter, when Nathaniel called him, insisted that what he had seen was real. He was certain that the bundle had been there. The hunter described it with such clarity that Nathaniel could not dismiss it entirely. And yet, as he stood there, staring at the empty barn, Nathaniel wondered if he had imagined it all. Was it just another cruel trick played by time and grief, leading him to believe in something that wasn't really there? The doubt gnawed at him, but deep down, Nathaniel knew one thing for sure. He couldn't stop now. He would not let the silence win. He refused to give up, not when he was so close, even if it seemed like nothing more than another false hope. So, Nathaniel began to dig deeper. He started looking into the barn's history, trying to piece together any possible connection to the past. The barn had once been owned by an old man who had passed away years ago, a man with no known family. But as Nathaniel continued to investigate, a new lead emerged. The old man, it turned out, had been tied to a prominent local family with a murky history, a family that had always been known for their wealth and influence, but also for their secrets. There were whispers, rumors, about their involvement in shady dealings, about things that had been swept under the rug. Nathaniel's stomach twisted. Could this new discovery, this old family, be connected to the disappearance of his sisters? Had they been involved in something that went far beyond what he had ever imagined? The more he dug, the more unsettling the connections became. There were stories of this family being involved in various unsolved disappearances over the years, though none as well known as Mariah and Elisa's. The pieces seemed to fit, but there was no clear evidence, no direct link. It was all speculation, all based on shadows and rumors. But still, Nathaniel pressed on. The mystery of the barn, the strange bundle that had never been found, and the family with its secrets. It was too much to ignore. The thought that someone, or something, in that barn could hold the key to unlocking the truth about his sister's disappearance kept him up at night. Even if he couldn't make sense of it all yet, Nathaniel knew he had to follow the thread, wherever it might lead. And as the years stretched on, the silence around Mariah and Elisa's case seemed to deepen. But Nathaniel refused to accept that the truth would never come. Something, anything, could still be out there, and as long as there was even the faintest trace of hope, he would keep searching. Even if the barn remained empty and the bundle remained a ghost, Nathaniel could not stop now, not when he was so close. By 1995, Nathaniel had spent nearly half of his life chasing the elusive truth behind his sister's disappearance. The years had left him a man marked by obsession, the search consuming him in a way that nothing else ever could. His life had become a loop of unending investigation, but with each passing year, the possibility of finding his sisters seemed less likely. As the years wore on, the answers he so desperately sought grew ever more distant. But just when it seemed as though hope was slipping away completely, a theory that had lingered in the community for decades resurfaced. It was a theory that had always been there, murmured in the background, but never confirmed. Some believed the disappearance of Mariah and Elisa wasn't an isolated tragedy, that it was linked to a notorious local family whose influence stretched deep through the town's history. The family, known for their wealth, their power, and their shady dealings, had always cast a shadow over the small community. The whispers had always been there, circulating like rumors, in a dark corner, but no one dared speak the truth. There were those who believed the family was involved, but the evidence was always circumstantial, nothing concrete enough to bring the truth into the light. Now, in 1995, the theory was being revisited with renewed vigor, and Nathaniel, more determined than ever, began to look into it again. As he dug into the family's history, the pieces began to fall into place, each one unsettling in its own way. The connection was subtle at first, a few threads that seemed to tie the family to his sister's disappearance, but nothing that would be considered proof. The more Nathaniel uncovered, the more he realized that this family's past was not one of simple wealth and influence. No, it was far more complicated and far darker than that. Stories began to emerge from the local elders, each one more chilling than the last. They spoke of the family's reputation, of their connections to the land, and of the power they wielded in ways that no one truly understood. What disturbed Nathaniel most, however, was a particular account, one that struck at the heart of his investigation. A man from this family had been seen around the time Mariah and Elisa disappeared, a man whose presence had been both curious and ominous. According to several witnesses, he had been in the area near the last place the girls were seen, and his whereabouts after the incident were shrouded in mystery. Some claimed he had disappeared, while others suggested he had simply returned to his family's estate, as if nothing had happened. Nathaniel's heart raced as he considered the implications. Could this man have been involved in the disappearance? Had he known something the rest of the town had not? Driven by the thought that this man might hold the key to unraveling the mystery, Nathaniel's search took him deeper into the history of the local family. He spent countless hours going through old records, meeting with locals who had lived through the family's rise to power. Yet, despite his best efforts, no one would confirm the connection between the family and the case. The townspeople were reluctant to speak, their fear of the family's influence keeping their tongues tied. Those who had once spoken freely now kept their silence, leaving Nathaniel to wonder if they knew more than they were willing to say. The deeper Nathaniel went, the more he found himself confronting dead ends. He reached out to surviving relatives of the family, hoping to find someone who might be willing to break the silence. But each time, he was met with cold resistance. The family's secrets, it seemed, were as tightly guarded as the town's dark history. Nathaniel's frustration grew, and with it, a growing sense of isolation. The more he uncovered, the more he realized that the answers he sought were not going to come easily. The search, which had always been his obsession, was now becoming something else, a haunting and unrelenting pull that left him exhausted and desperate. Despite the overwhelming sense of defeat, Nathaniel couldn't bring himself to stop. The idea that this family, with all its secrets, all its connections, could hold the truth was a tantalizing one. But as the years passed, the weight of the search began to take its toll. He had once been a part of a community, a man surrounded by family and friends who had supported him. Now, he stood alone, his life consumed by the need to uncover the truth, even if it meant facing the very people who had always been untouchable. His obsession with the past seemed to feed on itself. Each new lead only deepened the mystery, and the longer Nathaniel searched, the more isolated he became. The world around him seemed to grow more distant with each passing year. His family, who had once been his strength, had now become shadows in his life, their distance a painful reminder that the search for his sisters had come at the cost of everything else. Yet Nathaniel could not stop. The theory, the connections, the whispers, they had become the only thing that kept him going. He knew the truth was out there, and despite the mounting obstacles, he couldn't bring himself to give up. But the more he dug, the more he realized that the search was not just for his sisters. It was a search for something deeper, something buried beneath layers of silence and fear. And as Nathaniel pressed on, the mystery only grew, becoming a part of him in ways he hadn't anticipated. What had started as a search for answers had now become a haunting journey into a past that refused to let go. In 2005, a fresh face arrived in the small town, eager to take on a case that had long since become a cold shadow hanging over the community. Emily Harris, a young investigator with little experience but a deep passion for solving the unsolved, was drawn to the story of Mariah and Elisa's disappearance. The case had been dormant for years, fading into the background as the town moved on. But for Emily, the allure of an old mystery, especially one so emotionally charged, was something she could not ignore. She felt an immediate connection to the case, believing that perhaps with a new perspective and fresh determination, she could uncover the answers that had eluded everyone else. From the outset, however, Emily's optimism quickly met resistance. The town, still haunted by the disappearance, had moved on. Some felt it was best to leave the past buried, a wound that had long since festered. The community was weary of the pain that the case stirred up, and Emily was viewed with a mixture of skepticism and indifference. For many, the search for Mariah and Elisa was a chapter best left closed. It had been too long. Too much time had passed, and the possibility of finding them seemed all but impossible. Despite the cool reception, Emily pressed on, determined to breathe new life into a case that had faded into the whispers of old stories. Her breakthrough came when she stumbled upon a long-forgotten journal. It belonged to a retired police officer who had worked on the original investigation. The officer, who had passed away years earlier, had left behind a record of his thoughts, a glimpse into a time when the case was still fresh. Emily felt a jolt of hope as she flipped through the pages, eager for any clue that might offer a breakthrough. But as she read, that hope quickly turned to frustration. The journal was riddled with cryptic notes, vague references to disturbing presence and traces of the girls found near an old burial site. The officer's words were fragmented, his thoughts seemingly torn between what he knew and what he couldn't quite grasp. The journal, instead of offering clarity, only deepened the mystery. The cryptic nature of the journal only pushed Emily further into the investigation, even as the answers she sought remained elusive. The more she dug into the past, the more she began to feel the weight of the case's long history bearing down on her. Her attempts to speak with the townspeople were met with silence. They had long since grown tired of the topic, and their unwillingness to open up to her felt like another wall she would have to scale. As she pressed on, the mystery seemed to slip further and further out of her reach, like sand through her fingers. Emily was facing not only the challenge of piecing together a decades-old puzzle, but also the ghost of a community that wanted nothing more than to forget. The journal mentioned a burial site, a place where traces of the girls were found, but it was vague, providing no clear direction or location. Emily's attempts to follow up on this lead were met with dead ends. The only surviving witness to the original investigation, an elderly man who had been one of the last people to see Mariah and Elisa before their disappearance, was in failing health. Time was running out for Emily to piece together his fragmented memories. Every attempt to sit down with him to ask the questions that might bring clarity was met with frustrating delays. The clock was ticking, and the longer Emily pushed forward, the more the case began to feel like a battle against time itself. But Emily could not let go. The journal's vague references to a burial site, to the disturbing presence that had lingered near it, haunted her. It was clear that there was something the original investigators had missed, something they hadn't been able to piece together. Emily had always believed that mysteries weren't solved by ignoring the small details, and here, she was convinced, was a key piece of the puzzle. She kept pushing, hoping that the more she uncovered, the closer she would get to solving it. Yet the walls continued to close in on her. The town, now disillusioned with the search, seemed to resist any further probing, and her sense of isolation grew. The investigation, once a promising pursuit, had become a painful reminder of the town's refusal to confront its past. The deeper Emily dug, the more she began to understand why no one had wanted to continue the search. It was not just about finding two missing girls, but about confronting the dark, uncomfortable truths the town had spent decades trying to bury. Emily had no choice but to continue, but as she did, it became clear that the case had never been just about Mariah and Elisa. It was about something deeper, something that connected the town's past to the present. Each new lead Emily uncovered seemed to lead to another question, and every answer seemed more elusive than the last. But despite the frustration and the mounting pressure, one truth remained. She couldn't stop now. The town had given up, but she hadn't. Mariah and Elisa's case was far from over, and as Emily pushed forward, she began to wonder if the silence she faced was not just resistance, but a deeper fear of what would happen if the truth finally came to light. In 2015, Nathaniel, now an elderly man, found himself standing before the barn once again, the very place that had haunted his thoughts for decades. The years had not been kind to him. His once strong frame had withered, and his steps had slowed, but the fire that had driven him to search for his sisters, Mariah and Elisa, never waned. He had spent so much of his life retracing their steps, chasing shadows, and now, for the first time in years, he was not alone. His son, now a grown man, stood beside him, his face marked by the same haunted curiosity Nathaniel had once seen in his own youth. His son had heard the stories, had lived with the absence of the sisters as much as Nathaniel had, and though the pain of the past weighed heavily on them both, there was a shared, unspoken determination in their eyes. Together, they stepped into the barn, the air thick with dust and the remnants of a time long gone. The floorboards creaked under their weight, the barn's skeletal frame sagging with age. Nathaniel's heart raced with a mix of hope and fear, but he refused to let himself falter. This place had been a ghost of the past for so long, it was time to confront it, to unearth the secrets it might be hiding. As they moved through the space, searching through old hay bales and piles of debris, Nathaniel couldn't shake the feeling that this might be the moment that brought him closer to the answers he had been seeking for so long. Hours passed in a quiet, methodical rhythm, the kind of silence that had become so familiar to Nathaniel in his years of searching. But just as the day was fading, his son's voice broke through the stillness. "Dad, look!" Nathaniel's heart skipped a beat as he turned to find his son kneeling by the floorboards. He had uncovered something buried beneath years of neglect. Nathaniel moved quickly, his hands trembling as he joined his son on the floor. The wooden planks had been pried apart, revealing a small wooden box, old and worn, its surface scratched by time. The box was carefully hidden, as if it had been placed there deliberately, its presence a secret kept for decades. Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat. Could this be it? Could this be the breakthrough he had been searching for all these years? Together, they lifted the box from its hiding place, the weight of it oddly comforting in Nathaniel's hands. He could hardly bring himself to open it, the anticipation too much to bear. With shaking fingers, he lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in yellowing cloth, were items that were unmistakable. Pieces of jewelry, tarnished with age but still recognizable. A torn photograph of two smiling girls, his sisters, Mariah and Elisa, and a letter. Nathaniel's heart pounded in his chest as he carefully unfolded the letter. It was from their mother, written in her familiar script, words that had been lost to time. He could almost hear her voice as he read, the pain and hope in her words echoing through the years. The letter, once thought lost, was a tangible link to the past, one that had been buried here, waiting to be found. The discovery was a shock, but it was not the answer Nathaniel had longed for. There were no remains, no sign of what had happened to Mariah and Elisa. The barn held only their belongings, things that had once been part of their lives, but now served as nothing more than remnants of a past long gone. Nathaniel's chest tightened as he realized that while the discovery reignited memories, it did not answer the one question that had haunted him for so long. What happened to his sisters? Still, the significance of the find was undeniable. The barn, a place that had been nothing more than a symbol of lost hope, had now become a focal point once again. The items, though not providing answers, were enough to revive the investigation, enough to renew the search for the truth. The small wooden box, hidden away for so many years, held pieces of a life that had been interrupted, pieces that now needed to be understood. Nathaniel had spent so much of his life wondering what happened, and now, at last, he had something tangible to hold on to. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, he knew the journey was far from over. The mystery remained. As father and son stood there in the quiet of the barn, surrounded by the faint echoes of a past they could never truly reclaim, Nathaniel's mind raced. The discovery of the box was just the beginning. The case had been reopened, but the truth remained elusive. What had happened to Mariah and Elisa? Where were they? And why had their belongings been left here, hidden for so many years? Nathaniel had no answers, but the box, the letter, the photograph. They were the first real clues in decades. His resolve, once shaken by years of searching, was reignited. He would not stop until he knew the truth, no matter how long it took. The memory of his sisters, now more vivid than ever, would never fade again. As the years passed, the case of Mariah and Elisa's disappearance seemed to lose its grip on the town. The search had faded into the background, and the memories of the sisters' faces began to blur, slipping further from the collective consciousness. But then, in 2020, something happened that reignited the flames of the investigation. The case, once cold, started to gain attention once again, thanks to a local elder who spoke up, offering a chilling new perspective. His name was Samuel, an old man with a lifetime of stories and a deep-rooted connection to the land. He had lived in the area all his life and carried with him a knowledge of the old ways, of traditions passed down through generations. In a meeting with the local media, Samuel spoke of something no one had considered before: an ancient curse. According to Samuel, the disappearance of Mariah and Elisa wasn't just a tragic event. It was tied to a legend, a tale of a malicious spirit that haunted the woods. He claimed that this spirit, a presence as old as the forest itself, had been known to claim the souls of those who wandered too far into the woods, taking them never to return. Samuel's voice was quiet, but the weight of his words was undeniable. He spoke with the conviction of someone who had lived his entire life within the shadow of this legend. The townspeople listened in stunned silence as he described the spirit, a figure said to dwell in the darkest corners of the forest, waiting for the unwary to stumble into its grasp. The spirit, Samuel claimed, was more than just a myth. It was a force that had claimed countless souls over the years, a curse that had never been broken. The media latched onto this theory, their interest piqued by the supernatural element that now surrounded the case. The story spread like wildfire, the town's name making headlines once again, but this time it was for something far more sensational. The legend, once confined to whispered tales around campfires, had now become part of the public narrative. Journalists from outside the area began pouring in, eager to learn more about the mysterious curse that seemed to tie the sisters' fate to the very land they had once called home. For many, the idea of a malicious spirit was the perfect explanation for the girls' disappearance, offering a sense of closure that was rooted in something beyond human understanding. But for Nathaniel, the idea of a curse was something he could not accept. He had spent years searching for answers grounded in reality, and now this supernatural theory threatened to derail everything he had worked for. He had always been skeptical of folklore, of tales that had been passed down through generations without proof. Yet, as Samuel's words lingered in his mind, Nathaniel couldn't help but feel a strange sense of unease. The more he thought about the details of the legend, the idea of a spirit that claimed those who ventured too far into the woods, the more it seemed to echo the circumstances of his sister's disappearance. The sisters had vanished while walking a familiar path, a trail that led deep into the woods near their home. They had been known to wander, to explore the very places Samuel spoke of, and Nathaniel couldn't deny the eerie similarities between the legend and the events that had unfolded all those years ago. Could there be more to this story than he had originally thought? Could the forest, with its deep, uncharted spaces, really be hiding a force beyond human comprehension? Nathaniel grappled with these questions, torn between his desire for rational explanations and the unsettling possibility that there was something more at play. As the days passed, the lines between myth and reality began to blur. Nathaniel's skepticism, once unwavering, was shaken by the growing number of strange occurrences that seemed to coincide with the legend. Elders from the community began to share their own encounters with the spirit, recounting unsettling stories of lost travelers and inexplicable disappearances. The more Nathaniel heard, the more he began to question everything he thought he knew about the case. He had always believed that the answers were out there, buried beneath the layers of time, but now he wasn't so sure. Could the truth really be tied to a curse, or was it simply a story that had been used to explain the unexplainable? The more Nathaniel reflected on the past, the more he wondered if his search for answers had blinded him to a possibility he had never considered. Was the disappearance of Mariah and Elisa truly a matter of human involvement, or was there something more to the woods than anyone had realized? His obsession with finding a logical explanation had kept him focused on the material world, but now he found himself wondering if there was something beyond that, something beyond what he had ever imagined. The curse, like the legend itself, remained a haunting presence in the back of his mind. As the investigation continued, Nathaniel found himself torn between two worlds, the world of rational investigation and the world of folklore, where spirits roamed and the boundaries of reality were not so clearly defined. He knew the search for his sisters had to continue, but now the question was not just about what had happened to them. It was about whether there was a force in the woods that could explain their disappearance, and if that force was something he could ever truly understand. In 2020, Nathaniel, now a frail, aging man, stumbled across a letter among his late mother's belongings that would shake him to his core. The letter, dated 1944, was addressed to Nathaniel's father, a man long gone from this world. It had been tucked away, forgotten for decades. Nathaniel, whose hands trembled as he opened it, knew immediately that this was no ordinary letter. It was a piece of their past, a piece of the mystery that had haunted his life for so long. The letter was from his mother, written just a year before Mariah and Elisa vanished. In it, she described an unsettling encounter, a conversation between the sisters and a mysterious stranger who had been visiting their home in the weeks leading up to their disappearance. The man had asked questions about the girls, questions that seemed innocuous at first but grew increasingly strange. Who was this man? Why had he been interested in Mariah and Elisa? Nathaniel could feel his pulse quicken as he read, the weight of those unanswered questions bearing down on him. His mind raced, piecing together the fragments of the past. This letter, a message from his mother that had been hidden away for so many years, seemed to confirm what he had always feared, that someone was watching them. But who was this man, and why had he been asking about the sisters? The letter's contents sent a jolt through Nathaniel, reviving old memories and fears he had long buried. The details in the letter matched stories he had heard over the years, rumors that had always seemed too vague to take seriously. There had always been whispers about a local family, one with a long, shadowy history in the area, whose name had been tied to the girl's disappearance. Over the years, Nathaniel had chased leads that pointed back to this family, but every time, the trail had gone cold. Now, reading his mother's words, he couldn't ignore the eerie similarities between the mysterious man described in the letter and the accounts of that family. Had the man visiting their home been part of this family? Was there a connection that Nathaniel had missed all these years? Nathaniel's hands shook as he reread the letter. He knew that this discovery, this one small piece of the puzzle, was both a breakthrough and a dead end. The letter didn't provide the answers he had hoped for, but it raised new, haunting questions. The identity of the man remained a mystery. No description, no clear indication of who he was or what his intentions had been. But the coincidence with the family, who had always been suspected of involvement, felt too strong to ignore. It was as if the missing piece of the puzzle had been sitting in front of him for decades, but until now, he had never been able to see it clearly. The revelation reignited Nathaniel's drive to uncover the truth, but it also left him feeling more lost than ever. The letter had opened a door, but it was a door that led into darkness. Who was this stranger? What was his connection to the girls, and why had he been interested in them? Nathaniel could not let go of the thought that this man held the key to understanding what had happened to Mariah and Elisa. But as the years had proven time and time again, answers were hard to come by, and the truth remained maddeningly out of reach. Determined not to let this new lead slip through his fingers, Nathaniel began to revisit the case with renewed vigor. He reached out to anyone who might have known something about the stranger, old neighbors, former friends, anyone who had lived in the area at the time. But once again, he was met with silence. The locals, still unwilling to speak openly, offered nothing more than cryptic answers and hesitant glances. It was as though the town itself had become a sealed vault, holding its secrets tightly, unwilling to let Nathaniel into its depths. His frustration mounted. The letter had given him a thread to pull, but every time he tugged at it, the thread seemed to break, unraveling into nothing. The more Nathaniel pressed, the more isolated he became. It felt as if the case was not just about finding his sisters, but about breaking through the barriers that had been put in place over decades of fear, silence, and secrecy. The town, his family, the local authorities, all had played a part in the way the case had been handled, or rather, mishandled. But now, with this letter in hand, Nathaniel had a chance to uncover the truth. However, the more he uncovered, the more his mind became clouded with doubt. The letter raised as many questions as it answered, and as the years passed, the specter of the unknown seemed to loom larger and larger. Where had this stranger come from? Why had he been interested in the sisters? And why, despite everything he had learned, was Nathaniel still no closer to the truth? As he sat alone, surrounded by the remnants of a case that had haunted him for most of his life, Nathaniel realized that the story of his sister's disappearance was not just about finding answers. It was about confronting the forces that had kept those answers hidden. The letter, though a breakthrough, was just the beginning. The stranger, the family, the town's refusal to speak, they were all part of a story that Nathaniel could never have imagined. And with each new revelation, he found himself pulled deeper into a mystery that seemed to stretch back further than he could ever have anticipated. The truth was still out there, but it was as elusive as ever. As Nathaniel's search neared its end, the weight of the years seemed to grow heavier. What had started as a mission to find his missing sisters, Mariah and Elisa, had become a relentless pursuit of truth, a quest that had consumed him for decades. And yet, despite everything he had uncovered, the answers remained maddeningly out of reach. The barn, the place that had once been nothing more than a forgotten structure, had become the epicenter of his investigation. The discovery of the sisters' belongings buried under the floorboards had sparked new life into the case, but Nathaniel knew that the puzzle was far from complete. The barn held secrets, but it was clear that the full story was still hidden in the shadows. It was then, in a moment of unexpected clarity, that Nathaniel's son made a breakthrough. While going through old family albums, his son stumbled upon a photograph taken shortly after Mariah and Elisa's disappearance. At first glance, it seemed like any other picture, a simple shot of the barn standing in a field. But as Nathaniel's son looked closer, an unsettling detail jumped out. The barn was not just a standalone structure, but part of a larger compound. And that compound, as it turned out, had once been owned by the same local family that had been rumored to be involved in the disappearance all those years ago. The connection was unmistakable. The barn, the family, and the missing sisters, it all tied together in a way Nathaniel had never imagined. For the first time, he began to understand how everything had come together, how the fate of his sisters might have been intertwined with this powerful family all along. But with this revelation, the pieces of the puzzle didn't seem to come together neatly. Instead, they scattered like debris in the wind, leaving him with more questions than answers. The photograph was a key piece of the puzzle, but it only led Nathaniel to more unsettling discoveries. As he continued his search, new evidence surfaced, though it only deepened the mystery. A family member, someone who had been hesitant to speak up before, had been recorded in an interview discussing the past. In the interview, a faint mention of the girls could be heard, spoken in such a way that it sent a chill down Nathaniel's spine. The mention was brief, almost an afterthought, but it was enough to confirm what Nathaniel had feared. The family knew more than they were willing to admit. But the question remained. What exactly did they know? What had happened to Mariah and Elisa, and why had they been involved? The tape was haunting, but it wasn't enough to force the answers out into the open. The recording, much like the photograph, only raised more questions. It was a sliver of truth, a whisper that seemed to be just out of reach. Nathaniel listened to the recording over and over, hoping for a revelation, but each time he was met with the same unnerving silence. The faint mention of the girls hung in the air like a ghost, leaving Nathaniel to wonder if the truth would ever come to light. As the investigation progressed, Nathaniel began to realize that the case might never be fully solved. The answers he had longed for were elusive, like smoke slipping through his fingers. The barn, now a symbol of everything he had lost, stood as a silent witness to the years of searching. And yet, despite the dead ends, despite the frustration and the uncertainty, Nathaniel couldn't let go. The pieces of the puzzle, though scattered and incomplete, had formed something undeniable. The connection between the barn and the family, the mysterious references to the girls, and the unspoken truths that had been buried for so long, they were all part of a story that Nathaniel could not walk away from. Though the case remained open, the weight of the unanswered questions pressed heavily on Nathaniel's heart. The sisters' disappearance had become more than just a case to solve. It had become a part of the town's history, a story that was now etched into the fabric of local legend. Mariah and Elisa's names were whispered in the streets, not as victims, but as symbols of the things the community had chosen not to confront. The barn, once just a building, had become a testament to the mystery that still lingered in the air, a haunting reminder of what had been lost and what had never been found. In the end, the case was left open, the truth just beyond reach. Nathaniel's search for closure had been a journey that took him through every corner of the past, but it had not brought him the peace he had hoped for. The missing pieces of the story remained scattered, like the remnants of a life that had been interrupted, and though Nathaniel would never stop searching, he knew that some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved. The story of Mariah and Elisa would never fade, not for him, not for anyone in the town. And while the barn would stand, a silent monument to a dark past, the truth, the final revelation, would remain elusive, slipping into the fog, forever a part of the town's unspoken legend.